The smell hit me first, 3 miles before we ever saw the gates. It was May 2nd, 1945, and our convoy of Women's Army Corps engineers was rolling through the Bavarian countryside on our way to assess infrastructure damage at a place called Dachau. The spring morning was beautiful, wildflowers blooming in the fields, birds singing in the trees, the kind of day that made you forget there was a war on. But then that smell came through the open windows of our deuce-and-a-half truck, and everything changed. "Good Lord," said Lieutenant Patricia Walsh, sitting beside me with our engineering assessment kits. "What is that?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. I was Technical Sergeant Rosa Martinez, Women's Army Corps Engineering Battalion, and in my 26 years on this earth, I'd smelled plenty of unpleasant things. Growing up in East Los Angeles during the Depression, working construction sites with my father before the war, serving 18 months in North Africa and Italy, assessing bomb damage and rebuilding infrastructure, I thought I'd encountered every terrible smell the world could produce. I was wrong. That smell was death, but not the quick death of combat, or even the slow death of disease. It was the smell of systematic murder, of human bodies treated like garbage, of evil so profound that it poisoned the very air for miles around. And as our convoy rolled closer to Dachau, as that smell grew stronger, and the spring beauty of the German countryside became an obscene contrast to the horror we were approaching, I had no idea that I was about to make a decision that would change the entire course of my life. Let me take you back to the beginning, so you can understand how a Mexican-American girl from Los Angeles ended up becoming one of the first women to enter the Nazi death camps, and why I chose to stay there for 2 years when I could have gone home. I was born in 1919 in East Los Angeles, the oldest of 6 children. My father, Manuel Martinez, was a master carpenter who'd come north from Sonora during the Mexican Revolution. My mother, Elena, worked as a seamstress when she wasn't raising kids. We weren't wealthy, far from it, but Papa had a trade that kept food on the table even during the worst of the Depression. Papa didn't have sons, but he had me, and from the time I was 8 years old, I was his shadow on every job site. While other girls were learning to sew and cook, I was learning how to read blueprints, swing a hammer, and calculate load-bearing requirements. By the time I was 16, I could frame a house, run electrical wiring, and do finish carpentry that would make grown men jealous. "Mija," Papa would tell me, "God gave you a brain and 2 strong hands. It's a sin to waste such gifts just because you're a girl. The world will tell you that you can't do this work, but you show them different." The world did tell me I couldn't do this work. I applied to every construction company in Los Angeles after high school, and not one would hire a woman, especially not a Mexican woman. I ended up working in a garment factory for 3 years, sewing uniforms for the army and hating every minute of it, even though I was grateful to have any job during the Depression. Then Pearl Harbor happened and everything changed. Suddenly, America needed every able body working, men for combat, women for everything else. When the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established in May 1942, I saw my chance. They needed mechanics, drivers, clerks, nurses, and engineers. I walked into the recruitment office in downtown Los Angeles on June 3, 1942, and the recruiting sergeant, a middle-aged woman named Barbara Collins from Iowa, looked at my application with raised eyebrows. "Engineering," she said, skepticism clear in her voice. "Miss Martinez, most of our women volunteers go into nursing or clerical work. Engineering is, well, it's extremely difficult work." I pulled out my portfolio, drawings I'd done for my father's projects, photographs of houses and buildings I'd helped construct, letters of recommendation from contractors who'd worked with Papa and had seen my abilities firsthand. "Sergeant Collins," I said, "I've been doing this work since I was 8 years old. I can read blueprints, I understand structural engineering, I can operate heavy machinery, and I can work harder than most men you'll ever meet. If the Army needs engineers, I'm ready to serve." She looked through my portfolio for a long moment, then smiled. "Well then, welcome to the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, Private Martinez. Lord knows we need women with real skills, not just warm bodies to fill uniforms." I went through basic training at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, where we learned military discipline, protocol, and how to march in formation. But more importantly, I was assigned to specialized engineering training, where I learned military construction standards, bridge assessment, road repair, and infrastructure evaluation. The Army was preparing us to follow combat troops into Europe, and rebuild the infrastructure that war had destroyed. In March 1943, I shipped out to North Africa with the first contingent of WS engineers. We landed in Oran, Algeria, and spent 6 months assessing bomb damage to ports, railways and roads, preparing infrastructure for the invasion of Sicily. The work was backbreaking, the heat was brutal, and the male soldiers treated us like we were playing dress-up in our uniforms. But we proved them wrong. Every bridge we assessed, every road we repaired, every port we got functioning again, demonstrated that women could do this work just as well as men. Better sometimes, because we had to work twice as hard to get half the respect. I earned my nickname Builder during the Sicily campaign in July 1943. Our unit was assigned to assess a damaged bridge near Palermo that American armor needed to cross. The male engineering officers declared it too damaged to repair quickly. They wanted to build a temporary bypass that would take 3 days. I looked at that bridge, did the calculations in my head, and told the lieutenant, "Sir, I can have that bridge operational in 18 hours with the right materials and a crew of 12. He was skeptical, but desperate. "You've got 12 hours, Sergeant Martinez. If you can't do it, we build the bypass." I worked through the night with a crew of Italian civilians and 3 American GIs who were willing to take orders from a woman. We shored up the damaged supports, replaced broken decking, and reinforced the whole structure with materials scavenged from destroyed buildings nearby. 14 hours later, Sherman tanks were rolling across that bridge, and Lieutenant Morrison was calling me Builder Martinez with genuine respect in his voice. From that moment on, I was Builder, not just to my unit, but to every soldier and officer who saw what I could do with engineering knowledge, determination, and crews willing to work under a woman's command. I spent the next 18 months following the Allied advance through Italy, then into France after D-Day. By April 1945, I was a technical sergeant with 2 Bronze Stars for my work rebuilding infrastructure under fire, and I'd proven 100 times over that women belonged in military engineering. When the war in Europe ended in early May, our unit received orders to assess infrastructure damage in southern Germany, particularly around Munich, where Allied bombing had been intense. We were told we'd be evaluating roads, bridges, railways, and utility systems in preparation for the American occupation. Nobody mentioned Dachau. Nobody told us what we were really going to see. On May 2, 1945, our convoy of 6 trucks carrying 32 WAC engineers rolled through the gates of Dachau concentration camp, and the world I thought I understood ended. The camp had been liberated by the 42nd Infantry Division 4 days earlier, on April 29th. The SS guards were gone, killed or captured during the liberation. The American soldiers who'd freed the camp were still there, looking shell-shocked and haunted, moving through the grounds like men who'd seen hell itself and couldn't quite process what they'd witnessed. Nothing in my 26 years had prepared me for what I saw when I stepped out of that truck. The living dead walked among piles of corpses. That's the only way I can describe it. Thousands of skeletal figures in striped uniforms, so thin that you could count every bone, shuffled through the camp with eyes that had seen things no human should witness. Many were too weak to stand. Some were lying in their own filth, unable to move, waiting to die now that liberation had come too late to save them. And the bodies. Dear God, the bodies. Stacked like cordwood outside the crematorium, dumped in pits, lying in the barracks where they died in the hours after liberation. Thousands of corpses, some so emaciated they barely looked human, all testimony to systematic murder on a scale I couldn't comprehend. Lieutenant Walsh vomited immediately. Several other women in our unit collapsed, overcome by the smell and the sight. I stood there, frozen, my engineering clipboard hanging uselessly in my hand, trying to understand how human beings could do this to other human beings. A captain from the 42nd Infantry approached us, his face grey with exhaustion and horror. "You ladies shouldn't be here," he said quietly. Nobody should see this." But we were there and we had to see it because someone had to bear witness. Someone had to document what the Nazis had done. Someone had to help the survivors, if help was even possible. Our initial assignment was simple: assess the camp infrastructure, determine what facilities could be salvaged for temporary housing for displaced persons, and recommend what should be demolished. We were supposed to spend 3 days there, write our report and move on to the next assignment. I stayed for 2 years. That first day, I walked through Dachau in a daze, trying to do my job, trying to focus on structural assessments and engineering evaluations, while all around me human suffering screamed for attention. I measured buildings that had housed torture chambers. I evaluated gas chambers disguised as showers. I inspected crematorium ovens that still contained human remains. And everywhere I walked, skeletal survivors watched me with eyes that held questions I couldn't answer. Why did this happen? Why didn't anyone stop it? Why did it take so long? On my second day at Dachau, I met Jakob Ehrlich. He was 47 years old but looked 70. A Polish Jew who'd survived 3 years in the camp through luck, cunning, and an iron will to bear witness. Before the war, he'd been a civil engineer in Warsaw. Now he was a living skeleton who spoke 6 languages and had somehow maintained his sanity through hell itself. He found me while I was inspecting the water system, trying to determine what was salvageable and what needed complete replacement. The pipes were rusted, contaminated, barely functional, typical of the entire infrastructure the Nazis had built with slave labor and maintained with brutality. "You are engineer?" he asked in heavily accented English, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned and saw him, maybe 90 pounds, striped uniform hanging off his frame, eyes that were too large in a skull-like face. But those eyes were sharp, intelligent, alive in ways that many other survivors' eyes were not. "Yes," I said, "I'm assessing the water systems." "I am engineer also," he said with quiet dignity. "In Warsaw, I design water systems for new buildings. Here," he gestured at the camp around us, "here, I watch them design systems for murder instead of life." We stood there in silence for a moment, 2 engineers looking at infrastructure that had been deliberately designed to dehumanize and destroy. "Can you help?" he asked finally. "So many sick, need clean water, need proper sanitation. American Army brings food, brings medicine, but water systems still poison. Need engineer who understands." Something shifted in me at that moment. I'd been looking at Dachau as an assignment, as a problem to assess and report on. Jakob was showing me it was something else entirely, a place where people were still suffering, still dying, still desperately needing help that I had the skills to provide. "Yes," I heard myself say, "I can help." That evening, I requested a meeting with Colonel William Bradford, the commanding officer overseeing Dachau operations. He was a career officer from Pennsylvania, 50 years old, who'd seen combat across Europe and looked exhausted by everything the war had demanded of him. "Colonel," I said, standing at attention in his makeshift office, "I request permission to extend my stay at Dachau beyond the initial assessment period." He looked up from his paperwork, surprised. "Sergeant Martinez, your initial assessment is that this entire camp needs to be demolished. What's there to extend?" "Sir, there are over 30,000 survivors here and in the subcamps. They're sick, malnourished, traumatized. The infrastructure is failing. The water system is contaminated. The sanitation systems are breaking down. The barracks are barely habitable. We can't just demolish everything and move these people somewhere else. They've been moved enough. They need stability, clean water, proper shelter while they recover. We have engineering battalions. With respect, sir, your engineering battalions are stretched thin rebuilding all of Germany. And none of them understand what these people have been through, what they need beyond just functional buildings." He studied me for a long moment. "Sergeant Martinez, you've done exemplary work throughout this campaign. Your record is excellent. If you want to go home, you've earned it. Why would you want to stay here in this place?" I thought about that question, about the real answer that I barely understood myself. "Because I have skills these people need, sir. Because Jakob Ehrlich was an engineer in Warsaw before the Nazis destroyed his life, and now he's asking me to help rebuild. Because," I paused, finding the words, "because I spent the whole war building things, bridges, roads, facilities. I want to spend the peace-building lives." Colonel Bradford was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Permission granted. You can have whatever resources I can spare, and you can stay as long as you feel you're needed. God knows there's enough work here for 100 engineers." The next morning, I started what would become 2 years of the hardest, most important work of my life. First priority was water. The camp's water system was contaminated with human waste, chemicals from the industrial facilities where prisoners had been forced to work, and decades of neglect. Clean water was essential for drinking, for sanitation, for basic human dignity. Jakob became my assistant, translator, and guide. Despite his physical condition, his mind was sharp and his knowledge invaluable. He knew every pipe in the camp, every connection, every problem, because he'd been forced to work on repairs during his imprisonment. "Here," he would say, pointing to a junction in the pipes, "SS make prisoners use poor materials, bad connections, because why build good when prisoners die anyway? Now water leaks into sewage, sewage leaks into water, everything poison." We worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week. I'd requisition materials from army supply, new pipes, fittings, valves, everything we needed. Jakob would organize work crews from among the survivors who were strong enough to work, men who desperately needed purpose and dignity after years of systematic dehumanization. At first, I used translators because Jacob was too weak to work full days. But as weeks passed and he gained weight on American army rations, he became stronger, more capable. Other survivors with construction skills joined our crews. They worked with an intensity that broke my heart. These men who'd been slaves, who'd been starved and beaten and worse, now working voluntarily to rebuild their temporary home. "Why do you work so hard?" I asked Jakob one day in June, after he'd insisted on working through lunch despite his obvious exhaustion. "You're free now. You could rest, recover." He looked at me with those two large eyes in his still gaunt face. "Sergeant Rosa, for 3 years I am thing, not person. Number, not name, animal, not human. Now I work beside American engineer. I use my skills again. I build instead of destroyed. This make me person again. Rest can wait." By July, we'd replaced the entire water distribution system for the main camp. Clean water flowed to every barracks, every medical facility, every kitchen. It sounds simple, but it meant everything. It meant fewer people dying from dysentery and waterborne diseases. It meant survivors could wash themselves and their clothes. It meant the most basic human dignity. But water was just the beginning. The camp infrastructure was failing everywhere. Electrical systems that sparked and threatened fires, sanitation systems that bred disease, barracks that were barely standing after years of neglect and overcrowding. I assembled a team of survivor engineers, Jakob the Polish civil engineer, David Rosenberg, who designed electrical systems in Berlin, Marcus Cohen, who'd been an architect in Prague, Rachel Stein, who'd studied structural engineering in Vienna before women were banned from universities. These brilliant people had survived the camp through combinations of luck, skill, and unbreakable spirits. Now they poured all their talent and energy into rebuilding. We became known as the Builders Brigade, a joke at first, then a source of pride. Survivors would come to us with problems, and we'd solve them. A barracks roof leaking? We'd fix it. Electrical fire hazard? We'd rewire it. Sanitation system backing up? We'd redesign it. But the real work, I slowly realized, wasn't just engineering. It was giving survivors purpose, agency, dignity. Every repair we made, every system we rebuilt, every improvement we implemented, it was all done by survivors working voluntarily, reclaiming their humanity through the simple act of building instead of being destroyed. Rachel Stein taught me this lesson in August 1945. She was 32 years old, had survived 4 years in Dachau, and had lost her entire family, parents, siblings, husband, 2 children. She'd survived because she was young and strong enough for labor, but the price of survival haunted her every day. She came to me one afternoon while I was designing a new shower facility. Actual showers, not gas chambers disguised as showers, a distinction that mattered more than I could express. "Sergeant Martinez," she said in excellent English learned in Viennese universities before Hitler annexed Austria, "may I help with the design?" I looked at her, this woman who'd been starved and brutalized and had lost everything, asking to help design a building. "Of course, Rachel. Your expertise in structural engineering would be invaluable." We worked together for hours, her suggesting modifications, me sketching the changes, both of us completely absorbed in the technical challenge. When we finished, she looked at the plans with something approaching satisfaction. "Do you know what the Nazis did to me?" she asked quietly. "They took everything, my family, my home, my country. But the worst thing they took was my identity. I was Dr. Rachel Stein, structural engineer, university lecturer. They made me prisoner 94732, nothing more. No name, no profession, no humanity." She touched the plans we'd drawn. This makes me Dr. Stein again. Not a prisoner, not a number, not a victim. An engineer, solving problems, building things. You give this to me, this chance to be myself again. This is more valuable than food or medicine." That's when I understood what I was really doing at Dachau. Yes, we were rebuilding infrastructure, But more importantly, we were helping survivors rebuild their identities, their sense of purpose, their belief that they were still the people they'd been before the Nazis tried to destroy them. The work expanded throughout 1945 and into 1946. Dachau was transformed from a death camp into a displaced persons camp, housing not just Dachau survivors, but thousands of other displaced Jews, political prisoners, and refugees from across Europe who had nowhere else to go. We built new housing, not barracks, but actual small homes where families could live together. We designed a school where children who'd spent years in hiding could learn again. We created workshops where survivors could practice trades, earn money, and regain dignity through work. We built a synagogue where Jews could worship openly for the first time in years, and a community center where survivors of all backgrounds could gather. My Builders Brigade grew to over 40 people, survivors with construction skills, refugees with engineering knowledge, displaced persons desperate for purpose. We worked together, American soldier and European survivors, building a temporary community that would eventually help these people transition back to normal life or emigrate to new homes. Jakob became more than my assistant. He became my friend, my teacher, my connection to understanding what these people had endured. As he regained health, as his body filled out and his strength returned, I watched him transform from living skeleton to functioning human being. But the journey was harder than any physical recovery. The body heals, he told me one evening in September 1945, as we sat outside the new carpentry workshop we'd just completed, watching the sunset over the Bavarian countryside. Give enough food, enough rest, the body recovers. But the soul, Sergeant Rosa, the soul carries scars that never heal. Do you have nightmares? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I could hear screaming from the barracks every night, survivors reliving their trauma in sleep. Every night, he said simply, I dream of the selections, the gas chambers, the crematorium fires. I dream of friends who died, of children murdered, of evil that should not exist in world made by God. These dreams will stay with me until I die. Then why stay here? I asked. Jakob, you're strong enough now to leave, to start over somewhere else. Why stay at Dachau? He looked at me with those eyes that had seen too much. Because others are not strong yet. Because I remember when I was weak, when I wanted to die, and others helped me survive. Now is my time to help. When everyone here is strong enough to leave, then I leave, not before. By spring 1946, Dachau had been transformed. The gas chambers and crematoriums had been preserved as evidence for the war crimes trials, but the rest of the camp was barely recognizable. Clean water, proper sanitation, decent housing, communal facilities, workshops, schools. It looked like a functioning town instead of a death camp. But the most important transformation wasn't in the infrastructure, it was in the people. Survivors who'd arrived as broken, traumatized victims were leaving as whole human beings with plans, dreams, and futures. Some emigrated to America, others to Palestine. Some returned to their home countries to search for surviving family members. But they left with something the Nazis had tried to destroy: their humanity intact, their identities restored, their belief in the future renewed. I received letters from dozens of survivors over the following months and years. Jakob wrote from New York, where he'd found work as a civil engineer and was helping to design the new United Nations building. Fitting work for a man who'd survived an attempt to destroy his entire people. Rachel wrote from Tel Aviv, where she was teaching structural engineering at the Hebrew University and helping build a new nation. David sent photographs from Chicago of the electrical contracting business he'd started, employing other refugees and giving them the chance to rebuild their lives. But the letter that meant the most came in July 1947, just before I finally left Dachau to return home. It was from Marcus Cohen, the architect who'd helped design the new housing units. Dear Builder, you taught us something at Dachau that I think you don't realize. Yes, you rebuilt infrastructure, water systems, electrical grids, housing, workshops. These things were necessary and important, but what you really did was show us that not all Americans were too late, too far away, too indifferent. You showed us that someone cared enough to stay, to work beside us, to treat us as equals and professionals instead of as victims or numbers. You gave us tools and materials, yes, but more importantly, you gave us purpose, dignity, and the chance to be ourselves again. Every pipe we laid, every wire we connected, every building we constructed. These were acts of reclaiming our humanity. The Nazis tried to reduce us to nothing. You helped us prove we were still engineers, architects, builders, creators. You helped us prove we were still human. Thank you, Builder. Thank you for staying when you could have left. Thank you for working beside us instead of just for us. Thank you for seeing us as people instead of as problems to be solved. The buildings we constructed together at Dachau are temporary. Eventually they'll be torn down or repurposed. But what we built in our souls through that work will last forever. Your grateful friend, Marcus. I left Dachau in July 1947, 2 years after I'd arrived for what was supposed to be a 3-day assessment. My commanding officers had long since stopped questioning my extended service. The work spoke for itself, and word had spread through the army about the whack engineer who'd stayed at Dachau to rebuild survivors' lives. On my last day, over 200 survivors gathered to say goodbye. Jakob presented me with a wooden box he'd carved himself in the workshop we'd built. A beautiful piece with intricate designs, showing tools of building, symbols of different faiths, and words in multiple languages that translated to Builder of Hope. You came to build pipes and buildings, he said, his voice stronger now but still carrying the weight of everything he'd survived. But you built something more important. You built our belief that good people exist, that humanity survives even after great evil, that we deserve to live and thrive instead of just survive. Rachel stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. The Nazis told us we were worthless, that the world would be better without us, that nobody cared if we lived or died. You proved them wrong, Builder. You stayed. You cared. You worked beside us as equals. That gift is beyond measure. I rode away from Dachau that afternoon with that wooden box on my lap and 2 years of memories that would shape the rest of my life. I'd gone there expecting to spend 3 days evaluating buildings. I'd stayed 2 years rebuilding lives, and in the process I'd rebuilt something in myself that I hadn't realized was broken. The war had made me hard, focused on tasks and missions and objectives. Dachau taught me that the most important work isn't about completing assignments. It's about recognizing human need and responding with everything you have, even when it means sacrificing your own comfort and plans. I returned to the United States in August 1947 and was honorably discharged from the Women's Army Corps in September. The Army offered me regular commissions, opportunities to continue my military career, but I declined. I'd found my real calling, and it wasn't in the military. I moved back to Los Angeles and started a construction company with my father, Martinez and Martinez Construction. But I specialized in something unusual, building facilities for refugee resettlement, community centers for displaced persons, housing for immigrants. I used my engineering skills to help people who were starting over, just like the survivors I'd worked with at Dachau. Jakob came to visit in 1949, healthy and strong, working as a civil engineer in New York, but taking time to see the woman who'd helped save his life and restore his identity. We toured my construction sites together, and he smiled when he saw what I was building. "Still building lives, Builder," he said. "Not just buildings, this is good." My father, who'd taught me everything I knew about construction, asked me one evening why I focused on refugee work when there was more money in commercial construction. "Papa," I said, "you taught me that God gave me a brain and 2 strong hands, and it would be a sin to waste such gifts. At Dachau I learned that those gifts aren't just for building structures, they're for building hope, dignity, and futures for people who've lost everything." He smiled and put his hand on my shoulder. "Your mother and I, we raised you right, Miha. You make us proud." I worked for 40 years in construction, specializing in facilities that served refugees, immigrants, and displaced persons. I built community centers, schools, housing complexes, workshops, places where people could rebuild their lives after losing everything. And every project, every building, every design carried with it the lessons I'd learned at Dachau. That the most important infrastructure isn't made of pipes and wires and concrete, it's made of dignity, purpose, and hope. Looking back now, I realize that those 2 years at Dachau were the most important of my life. Not my combat service, not my engineering achievements, not any of the awards or recognition I received. What mattered was choosing to stay when I could have left, choosing to work beside survivors, instead of just building for them, choosing to use my skills not just to construct buildings, but to reconstruct lives. The army sent me to Dachau to assess infrastructure. I stayed to rebuild humanity. And in the process, those survivors rebuilt something in me, a understanding that true strength isn't about what you can build with your hands, but what you can restore in the human spirit through compassion, commitment, and the simple decision to stay when others leave. This was the story of Technical Sergeant Rosa Bilder Martinez, Women's Army Corps Engineering, who came to Dachau for 3 days and stayed 2 years, not because she had to, but because she couldn't look at human suffering and turn away. Her service, documented in military records and confirmed by dozens of grateful letters from survivors, reminds us that the most important work of war isn't always about winning battles. Sometimes it's about healing the victims of those battles with patience, skill, and uncommon compassion. Rosa's story demonstrates that true service means recognizing need and responding with everything you have, regardless of orders or assignments or convenience. The survivors who worked beside her rebuilding Dachau went on to rebuild their lives across the world, carrying with them the lesson that humanity survives even the darkest evil, and that sometimes all people need is someone who cares enough to stay. What struck you most about Rosa's story? Have you heard similar accounts of those who stayed behind to rebuild after liberation? These personal stories help us understand not just the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, but the long process of healing and reconstruction that followed. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Captain Thomas Red McCarthy, a Graves registration officer, who spent 3 years identifying and honoring the dead across Europe, and what that sacred duty taught him about the true cost of war. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.